What if the parts of yourself you fear the most are actually holding the key to your greatest strength? We all have a hidden dark side, a shadow that whispers from the depths of our psyche. But what if instead of running from it, we learn to embrace it? This video dives into Jung's revolutionary concept of the shadow, showing you how confronting your inner darkness can unlock unparalleled personal growth and lead to a more authentic you. Because the truth is, everyone who's ever experienced a breakthrough moment has first faced what they've been running from their entire lives. And what you're about to discover might completely change how you see yourself. Carl Jung sat in his study in Zurich, early 1900s, watching his patients wrestle with parts of themselves they couldn't name. He noticed something profound. The traits people despised in others were often the very qualities they'd buried within themselves. This observation became the foundation of one of psychology's most misunderstood concepts, the shadow. But here's what most people get wrong. The shadow isn't evil. It's not some demonic force lurking inside you waiting to destroy your life. Jung's true definition is far more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting. The shadow represents everything in your unconscious mind that you've repressed, denied, or simply refused to acknowledge. It's the collection of characteristics, desires, impulses, and emotions that didn't fit the image you wanted to project to the world. Maybe your family valued politeness, so you pushed down your anger. Perhaps your culture celebrated modesty, so you suppressed your ambition. Or maybe you experienced shame around certain desires, so you locked them away in the darkest corners of your psyche. Jung believed that every human being has a shadow, without exception. It's not a flaw in your character, it's a fundamental aspect of being human. The shadow forms in childhood as you learn what's acceptable and what's not. Your parents praise certain behaviors, so you amplify those. They punish or ignore others, so you hide them. Society reinforces these lessons through countless subtle and not-so-subtle messages. Layer by layer you build a persona, the mask you show the world, while everything that doesn't fit gets pushed into the shadow. But here's where it gets interesting. The shadow doesn't contain only negative traits. You might have repressed your creativity because it seemed impractical. You might have hidden your vulnerability because it felt like weakness. You could have suppressed your joy because others called you too much. The shadow holds all the parts of you that didn't receive permission to exist. And those who've discovered what's hidden there often describe it as finding pieces of themselves they didn't know were missing. Imagine you're scrolling through social media and suddenly feel a surge of irritation at someone's post. They're bragging about their success, and something about it makes your blood boil. You think, they're so arrogant, so self-absorbed. But Jung would ask, what if that intense reaction is actually your shadow speaking? What if the trait you're criticizing in them is one you've forbidden yourself from expressing? Shame is often the shadow's loudest alarm. When you feel disproportionate shame about a mistake, a desire, or even a fleeting thought, you're likely touching something your shadow contains. That crushing embarrassment when someone sees you cry, that's your shadow around vulnerability. The mortification when you make a small error at work, that's your shadow around imperfection. Shame says, this part of me is unacceptable, and your shadow grows stronger with each denial. Anger presents differently but speaks just as clearly. If you were taught that anger is dangerous or inappropriate, you've likely pushed it into your shadow. Now it emerges in passive-aggressive comments, sudden explosions over minor issues, or chronic tension in your body. The anger didn't disappear when you repressed it, it just found other ways to express itself. People who suppress anger often describe feeling like they're walking on eggshells in their own lives, never quite sure when something will trigger an outsized reaction. Jealousy might be the shadow's most revealing messenger. When you feel intense envy towards someone, pay attention. Jung would say that person is living out an aspect of your shadow. If their freedom makes you jealous, perhaps you've repressed your own need for autonomy. If their confidence triggers envy, maybe you've buried your own potential for self-assurance. Jealousy isn't pretty, and most people feel ashamed of it, which creates a shadow within the shadow, a meta layer of repression that makes the original issue even harder to access. These emotions aren't problems to be fixed or sins to be confessed. They're breadcrumbs leading you back to forgotten parts of yourself. Every person who's ever sat with these uncomfortable feelings long enough to understand them has discovered something valuable underneath the initial discomfort. Now here's a connection you might not expect. Jung's shadow concept provides a perfect metaphor for one of technology's most pressing challenges: hidden biases in artificial intelligence. Just as humans have unconscious blind spots, AI systems inherit the shadows of their creators. And this parallel reveals something crucial about both human psychology and technological development. Consider how AI learns. Machine learning algorithms train on massive data sets created by humans, which means they absorb all our conscious values and our unconscious biases. An AI hiring tool might systematically reject qualified candidates based on patterns it detected in historical data, patterns that reflect human prejudices we'd consciously reject. A facial recognition system might perform poorly on certain demographics because the training data contained blind spots from its developers. These aren't intentional choices, they're the technological equivalent of the shadow, unexamined assumptions operating beneath conscious awareness. The AI ethics community has discovered what Jungian psychologists have known for decades. You cannot eliminate bias or shadow through suppression alone. When tech companies try to simply filter out problematic outputs without examining the underlying patterns, they often create new problems. The bias doesn't disappear, it just manifests differently. Similarly, when you try to fix your shadow by simply controlling your behavior more rigidly, you don't resolve anything, you just push the content deeper. Both fields are learning the same lesson. Integration requires conscious examination. AI researchers now emphasize interpretability, understanding why an AI makes certain decisions. Jungian analysts emphasize making the unconscious conscious, understanding why you make certain psychological choices. In both cases, shining light on hidden patterns is the first step toward genuine change. The tech world's collective struggle with algorithmic bias is humanity's individual struggle with the shadow, played out on a global stage. And this is just the beginning of understanding how deeply our psychological patterns shape the world we're creating. We live in an era of unprecedented complexity and unprecedented exposure. Every opinion you hold, every mistake you make, every aspect of your personality can be broadcast, recorded, and scrutinized. Social media has created a global stage where everyone performs their persona, their carefully curated self, while the shadow grows larger and more volatile in the darkness. This dynamic makes shadow work not just personally valuable, but culturally essential. The modern world demands more psychological flexibility than any previous generation required. You navigate multiple identities: professional self, family self, online self, private self. Each context has different rules about what's acceptable, which means more material gets pushed into the shadow. You might be assertive at work but passive at home, confident online but anxious in person, generous with strangers but resentful with family. These contradictions create internal pressure, and that pressure has to go somewhere. When collective shadows remain unexamined, societies make catastrophic mistakes. History shows us that unacknowledged collective shadows fuel everything from systemic discrimination to environmental destruction. On a personal level, your unexamined shadow influences every decision you make, every relationship you form, every opportunity you pursue or avoid. It's the invisible hand guiding your life, and most people never realize it's there until something breaks: a relationship, a career, their mental health. The digital age amplifies shadow dynamics exponentially. Online anonymity lets people express shadow material they'd never voice in person. The algorithm-driven echo chambers we inhabit reinforce our conscious beliefs while our shadows fester unexamined. Political polarization intensifies as groups project their collective shadows onto opposing sides. Those who understand this dynamic can navigate the modern world with more wisdom and less reactivity. Understanding your shadow isn't self-indulgent navel-gazing, it's a survival skill for the 21st century. It's the difference between being controlled by unconscious patterns and making conscious choices. It's the foundation for genuine personal responsibility in an age where it's easier than ever to blame external forces for internal struggles. Here's the paradigm shift that changes everything. Your shadow isn't just a collection of problems to be managed. It's a reservoir of untapped potential, raw energy, and authentic power. Jung understood something revolutionary. The traits you've repressed don't disappear. They remain alive in your unconscious, waiting. And when you learn to access them consciously, they become fuel for transformation. Creativity lives in the shadow. Think about it. Creativity requires accessing thoughts and impulses that deviate from the norm, that challenge conventional thinking, that express what others might judge. If you've spent your life being appropriate and responsible, your creative impulses have likely been pushed into the shadow. Artists, writers, and innovators throughout history have understood this intuitively. They've learned to dance with their darker impulses, their weird obsessions, their socially unacceptable fascinations, and transform that energy into groundbreaking work. Authentic strength emerges when you stop pretending to be perfect. The person who admits their struggles, acknowledges their flaws, and owns their complexity is infinitely more resilient than someone desperately maintaining a flawless facade. When you integrate your shadow, you stop fearing exposure because there's nothing left to hide. You develop genuine confidence rather than its brittle cousin, defensive superiority. People who've done this work describe feeling like they can finally breathe, like they've put down a weight they didn't realize they were carrying. The shadow serves as a catalyst for personal growth precisely because it contains everything you need to evolve beyond your current limitations. Your repressed anger might be teaching you about boundaries. Your hidden selfishness might be pointing toward necessary self-care. Your suppressed ambition might be the key to fulfilling your potential. But how do you actually access this? How do you transform something that's been festering in darkness into a source of power? The answer lies in recognition, and that's exactly where we're headed next. Jung discovered a psychological phenomenon so reliable you can use it as a diagnostic tool: projection. Whatever you strongly react to in others, especially when the reaction seems disproportionate, is often an indication of your own shadow content. The mechanism is beautifully simple. Your psyche recognizes in others what it knows intimately but won't acknowledge in itself. Pay attention to your triggers. When someone's behavior makes you irrationally angry, ask yourself, what am I seeing in them that I've forbidden in myself? If someone's neediness repulses you, perhaps you've repressed your own dependency needs. If someone's confidence seems like arrogance, maybe you've pushed down your own legitimate pride. The person isn't necessarily displaying the trait you think you see. Your shadow is using them as a screen onto which it projects what's been hidden. Relationships become mirrors once you understand this dynamic. The traits that most irritate you in your partner, your colleagues, your family members, these are often your shadow speaking. This doesn't mean the other person isn't actually displaying those traits, but the intensity of your reaction, the charge it carries, that belongs to you. People who've learned to use relationships as shadow recognition tools describe it as gaining X-ray vision into their own psyche. Here's a practical exercise. Make a list of people you strongly dislike or judge. Write down the specific traits that bother you about each person. Now ask yourself honestly, in what ways do you exhibit these same traits, even in subtle or hidden forms? You might not express them the same way, but the core quality is there. The perfectionist who judges others' sloppiness might be suppressing their own desire to let go and be messy. The person who criticizes others' selfishness might be denying their own unmet needs. The triggers are clues, breadcrumbs your unconscious leaves to help you find your way back to wholeness. Every person who's followed these clues with genuine curiosity, rather than defensive justification, has discovered parts of themselves they thought were lost forever. So you've recognized your shadow. Now what? Jung developed a technique called active imagination for engaging with unconscious material. It's not suppression, not control, not warfare against yourself. It's conversation. It's relationship. It's learning to sit with what you've exiled and listening to what it has to say. Start simple. When you notice a shadow trait, let's say you recognize that you've repressed your anger, don't immediately try to fix it or justify it or make it go away. Instead, get curious. In a quiet moment, imagine your anger as a separate entity. If it had a voice, what would it say? If it had needs, what would they be? This might feel strange at first. You might think you're making things up. But Jung believed that what emerges from this practice is real psychological content, material your conscious mind hasn't had access to. The key is approaching your shadow with something radical, compassion. Your shadow formed because parts of you didn't feel safe to exist. Shaming those parts now will only push them deeper. Instead, try to understand why they went into hiding. What was the threat? What were you protecting yourself from? Most people discovered that their shadow formed from reasonable decisions made by a younger, more vulnerable version of themselves. That angry part you suppressed, it was probably trying to protect you from being hurt. That selfish part you denied, it was probably asserting needs that weren't being met. Active imagination isn't a one-time event, it's an ongoing dialogue. You might journal conversations with your shadow. You might create art that expresses shadow material. You might work with a therapist trained in depth psychology. The method matters less than the intention. You're making room for what's been excluded. You're integrating rather than eliminating. But the next part changes everything because there's a crucial distinction most people miss when they first start this work. Here's the fear that stops most people from engaging with their shadow. If I acknowledge these dark parts of myself, won't I become them? If I accept my anger, won't I become violent? If I recognize my selfishness, won't I become a narcissist? This misunderstanding has prevented countless people from doing necessary psychological work. So let's clarify what integration actually means. Embracing your shadow doesn't mean acting it out. There's a profound difference between acknowledging that you contain aggressive impulses and actually being aggressive. Between recognizing selfish desires and behaving selfishly. Between accepting sexual thoughts and acting on them inappropriately. Integration means making these contents conscious so you can choose how to relate to them, not giving them free rein over your behavior. In fact, the opposite is true. Unacknowledged shadow content is far more likely to control you. When you don't recognize your anger, it leaks out in passive-aggressive behavior, chronic resentment, or sudden explosions. When you deny your selfishness, you might oscillate between self-sacrifice and resentful martyrdom. When you suppress sexual thoughts, they might emerge in compulsive or problematic ways. Consciousness creates distance. Awareness creates choice. You won't become the monster. That's the beautiful paradox. The monster is what the shadow becomes when it remains unconscious, twisted and distorted by years of denial. When you bring it into the light, when you acknowledge it without judgment, it transforms. The repressed anger becomes healthy assertiveness. The denied selfishness becomes appropriate self-care. The suppressed desire becomes creative energy. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a wild animal living in your basement, and you've been pretending it doesn't exist. That animal is scared, hungry, and reactive. Now imagine you finally open the basement door, see the animal clearly, and start feeding it, understanding it, relating to it with respect. It doesn't become tamer by being denied. It becomes integrated through being seen. Those who've experienced this transformation described feeling more in control than ever before, not less. More themselves, not less. So, what does life actually look like after you've done this work? What changes when you integrate your shadow? The transformation manifests across every domain of your existence, often in ways you didn't predict. People report feeling like they've upgraded their operating system. Same person, but suddenly running more efficiently, more authentically, more powerfully. Relationships shift first. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others, you can finally see them clearly. That partner you are constantly criticizing, you might discover they're not actually the problem. Your repressed traits were distorting your perception. Conflicts that once seemed unsolvable become negotiable because you're no longer fighting unconscious battles. Friends and family often comment that you seem more real, more present, less defensive. The walls come down because you're no longer protecting a false self. Creative blocks dissolve when shadow material becomes available as fuel. Writers describe finding their authentic voice. Artists talk about accessing deeper, more honest work. Entrepreneurs discover the audacity they'd been suppressing. That's because creativity requires psychological freedom, the ability to explore thoughts and impulses without immediate censorship. When your shadow is integrated, that censoring mechanism relaxes. You can think thoughts, feel feelings, and explore ideas without triggering internal alarms. Authentic confidence emerges naturally when you're no longer maintaining a facade. You stop seeking external validation because you've validated yourself, all of yourself, even the parts that aren't pretty. This isn't arrogance or grandiosity, it's solid self-acceptance. People describe feeling grounded in a way they never experienced before. Criticism still stings, but it doesn't devastate. Praise still feels good, but you don't desperately need it. You know who you are, completely, and that knowledge creates unshakable foundation. The ripple effects extend further than you'd imagine. Your career might shift as you stop pursuing goals designed to compensate for shadow material. Your values might clarify as you distinguish between authentic desires and reactions against repressed traits. Your entire life might reorganize around a more honest center. Everyone who's experienced this describes it as coming home to themselves. One final crucial piece remains, and it's about where you go from here. You might be wondering, this sounds profound, but where do I actually begin? The answer is simpler than you think, though the practice requires courage. Start with observation. For the next week, pay attention to your reactions. When someone irritates you, when you feel intense emotion, when you judge someone harshly, pause and ask, what is this showing me about myself? Don't analyze it to death. Don't solve it immediately. Just notice. Write it down if that helps. This simple practice of observation begins to illuminate what's been operating in darkness. Understand that this is not a one-time project with a completion date. Shadow work is an ongoing relationship with yourself. You'll discover new layers as you evolve. Life will present new situations that trigger previously unrecognized shadow material. This isn't a failure of the process, it's the process. Jung himself continued examining his own shadow throughout his entire life. Those who approach this with a growth mindset rather than a perfectionistic one find the journey far more sustainable. The authentic you, the whole you, including the parts you've hidden, is worth the effort. You've spent years, maybe decades, maintaining a partial version of yourself. You've invested enormous energy into suppression, control, and image management. What if you redirected that energy toward integration instead? What if the person you're afraid of becoming is actually closer to who you genuinely are than the person you've been pretending to be? You're not alone in this. Every single human being has a shadow. Every person you admire, every person you consider psychologically healthy, every person who seems to have it all together, they're either actively working with their shadow or they're unconsciously controlled by it. There's no third option. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. The question is whether you'll have a relationship with it or let it run your life from behind the scenes. This is the work of a lifetime, and paradoxically, it's the work that makes life worth living. Because wholeness isn't about being perfect, it's about being complete. It's about reclaiming every part of yourself that you exiled in order to be acceptable. And those parts, when welcomed home, transform from enemies into allies. Your shadow isn't your adversary. It's your unrealized potential waiting for recognition. The journey starts with one honest look at what you've been avoiding, and everyone who's taken that look has discovered that what they feared was exactly what they needed.